We'll continue with our breaking news in RT because the US has suspended bilateral talks with Russia on the Syrian peace process, and we can now get some details from our Washington correspondent, Gianni Chikyan, who joins us. Good evening to you, Gianni. So what have US officials been saying then?
Good evening, Andrew. The U.S. is suspending ties with Russia on the cessation of hostilities deal, which Moscow and Washington brokered earlier in September. The State Department says Russia failed to live up to its commitments and was, quote, either unable or unwilling to ensure Syrian regime adherence to the arrangements to which Moscow agreed. Rather, the statement says, Russia and the Syrian regime have chosen to pursue a military course. I asked the State Department if the U.S. lived up to its own obligations under the deal. You said Russia did not live up to its obligations under the deal. Did the U.S. fully live up to its obligations?
We believe we did.
Did the U.S. separate the rebels from terrorists as it said it would?
As we talked about last week, the United States continued to have detailed, ongoing discussions with members of the opposition, emphasizing our view on the importance of demobilizing, of pulling apart from Nusra.
Under the deal, it was incumbent on the U.S. to get leading rebel groups to abide by the ceasefire and to separate them from Al-Nusra, which is Al-Qaeda in Syria. However, from day one of the agreement, Syria's second largest rebel group, Ahrar al-Sham, came out and said that they would not abide by it, that they would not separate themselves from Al-Nusra in Aleppo. To my question whether the U.S. expected a unilateral ceasefire on the part of Russia and the Syrian army, there was no clear answer at the State Department. It is also not clear if the U.S. now has its own plan of fighting Al-Nusra in Aleppo, or whether Washington now just left it to Russia. For many months, the U.S. hadn't really targeted that group, even though it is Al-Qaeda. Here's what the State Department said last week on that.
You hit Nusra, I believe you described it as Al-Qaeda, maybe in March or something, or February. It was earlier this year.
Yep.
Since then, there hasn't been any specific action against Nusra, is that right? Military action?
No, but I'd have to double check. I just can't definitively say that. As they became intermingled, and as they became intermingled in civilian areas, we've always sought to limit, the possibility of civilian casualties.
Meanwhile, the White House has denounced Russia's role in fighting ISIL in Syria. Here.
What we have seen from the Russians in the year or so since their military intervention in Syria is that they have not made much progress against ISIL. They claim that the reason that they're in Russia or in Syria is to fight extremists, but they haven't made they haven't achieved a significant counter-ISIL objective in more than 7 months, and they've been reduced to trying to claim credit for successful U.S. operations.
Apparently, liberating the ancient city of Palmyra from ISIL and hitting ISIL's oil facilities and tankers did not count in the eyes of the White House. The U.S. considerably stepped up its operations, including strikes against ISIL's oil targets, at the same time as Russia began targeting the terrorist group a year ago. Since the beginning of its operation in Syria, Russia has focused not only on ISIL, but also on Al-Nusra. But in parts of Syria, Al-Nusra teamed up with rebel groups that Washington considers legitimate Syrian opposition, and as a result, the U.S. had been reluctant to target them.
OK, thanks, Gianni. That was RT's Gianni Chikyan there. Well, a bit earlier, I spoke with RT's Ilya Petrenko about Russia's reaction to America's announcement.
Russia's envoy to the UN has reacted to this. Vitaly Churkin is saying that when it comes to a peaceful resolution of the Syrian conflict, there is no alternative to Russia-U.S. contacts on Syria. And he also went on to say that it is enormously regrettable that Washington made this announcement today. Now, according to the Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova, Washington hasn't been able to live up to its own obligations and now is trying to make someone else responsible for its failures.
The question is why Washington is unable to fulfill its promise to separate terrorist and the so-called moderate opposition. Washington failed to live up to key commitments to ease the humanitarian situation in Aleppo, and now, apparently, it's trying to shift responsibility to someone else.
In the meantime, while Washington goes for this decisive yet controversial move and cuts ties with Russia, the EU has announced that the union's foreign policy chief, Federica Mogherini, and her Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, have agreed to do all they can to make sure that EU's emergency humanitarian initiative for Aleppo works out. So in that sense, Washington and the European Union are looking in different directions at this point. Going back to Washington's move, it's right now, of course, difficult to predict how it is going to play out and affect the situation on the ground in Syria. But we've already heard comments from a White House spokesperson who said that Russia will become increasingly isolated internationally and that also Moscow will pay an international price for its failure to live up to the expectations that perhaps the American side was putting on the Russians. Now, speaking for paying the price, we already heard somewhat similar comments by the U.S. State Department spokesperson John Kirby.
Extremist groups will continue to exploit the vacuums that are there in Syria to expand their operations, which will include, no question, attacks against Russian interests, perhaps even Russian cities. And Russia will continue to send troops home in body bags.
Okay,